Hi, everybody. My name is Mbali, and I am Skateistan's programs manager, focusing on monitoring and evaluation. At Skateistan, we call it monitoring, evaluation, and learning, MEL. There's different types of ways you can use this term, but of course, we'll delve right into that as soon as I've introduced all of our speakers. I'll be facilitating this call alongside my colleague, Niall. Niall is Niall Moran. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he's our MEL officer at Skateistan. Next slide, please. Okay, and our guest speakers that we've included in this conversation today are Leanne Adams. She's a program evaluation specialist, and she's working with NACOSA at the moment. She'll be giving us a lot of useful information that we can use in our organizations. And Mateja, who is currently working as a Goodpush officer. So she's working at Skateistan at the moment, but she's also the co-founder of Free Movement Skateboarding. And she'll be talking to us about how to get your MEL done in sort of like low budget, low cost, low manpower situation. She'll be giving us some details on that. I'll give the mic over to Niall, who'll talk us through some of the more technical aspects of this program, of this day, of the summit. Niall, over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mbali. Hey everyone, I'm Niall. As Mbali introduced me, I'm the MEL officer at Skateistan, based in Berlin. And yeah, happy to be here. And yeah, as mentioned, we are recording, so yeah, people can turn their cameras off if they wish to not be recorded. Also, please remember to mute your microphone. And yeah, please stay engaged in the chat. Any emoji reactions are encouraged. I think Zoom has advanced in the technology where now you can put every emoji as a reaction, so please celebrate that. Comments in the chat are very much encouraged, but probably best to keep questions towards the end. And yeah, the goals of the webinar today are to introduce the concept of M&E, monitoring and evaluation, and to understand the importance of that, demystifying monitoring and evaluation, measuring your organization's impact, and also getting started with your monitoring and evaluation. So just to give you kind of all-around idea of it, how it can help, taking away the kind of daunting title of monitoring, evaluating, and learning into something much more digestible and comprehensible. But yeah, hopefully in between a lot of my babbling and probably terrible jokes, there will be some good hard information from our guest speakers and from Mbali. And yeah, at the end, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of monitoring, evaluating, and learning. Next slide, please, Rihanna. Yeah, just to give a quick overview. So we'll start with a brief introduction into monitoring and evaluation with myself, where I'll discuss, yeah, a little bit about what I know using Skateistan as a kind of case study. Following that, we'll be discussing measuring impact with Leanne, and then on to monitoring and evaluating on budget with Ruby, and then lessons learned with Mbali and myself, and we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. And I believe we will jump into a poll on the next slide to assess everyone's kind of understanding of monitoring and evaluation.
Cindy, will you be able to launch the poll? There we go.
Has it launched in Mbali?
It has. We are getting some responses rolling in.
Cool.
So we'll leave it open for about 30 seconds more.
Cool.
And just get some information from everyone on where they are with their MEL. Okay, we have 25 of 33 answers so far. We're almost there at 100%. Keep those answers coming in. It's okay if you've never heard of MEL as well. This is why we're having this workshop.
Cool. Yeah, so a nice variety, but it seems like most people are kind of in the middle, understand some basic concepts and practices. I think we have an expert here who hopefully won't call me out in front of everyone, but yeah, that's great to understand that people have, you know, at least have some understanding, or also great to see that people have kind of never heard of it, because we will be giving a basic intro to monitoring evaluation and all the benefits it can have for your organization and your stakeholders as well. So yeah, great to have so many different people from different areas and obviously different skills and knowledge of MEL as well. Yeah, awesome. Cool. So yeah. So I'll begin this section, which is what is MEL? So MEL, even just to start with the letters, is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So monitoring in the terms of how do you know your programs are happening the way that you planned? Are they reaching the stakeholders you meant to reach? Are they addressing the areas you wanted to address? Are they going as you planned it? Evaluation, how do you know that the quality of your programs are good? Yes, there's a start and an end, but in between, how do you know you're delivering quality? Are the participants benefiting in the way that you hope they would? Excuse me. Are they achieving what you set out for them to help to support them to achieve? And then following this learning, what can we change? What can we do better based on the information we have? What have we succeeded at? And more often, what have we failed at is the more important question. And especially within MEL, it's important to face these failures head on. Maybe failures is a negative word to use, but there's these opportunities where you see your shortfallings and you can address it. And it gives you a chance to address it rather than, say, if you have a 3-year program, you can do it somewhere along the way rather than start and finish. But within the learning, we can increase our accountability to the participants and the community and the stakeholders within the programs we deliver. The accountability to the wider organization, to the board members, to the staff, and also accountability to donors to prove, skateboarding can change lives, prove skateboarding can empower youth from different areas, to prove, your goal and your mission. And yeah, within this, you can see, sorry, as I very amateurly go to my notes. I'll use Skateistan as kind of the example here. So Skateistan's mission is to empower youth from disadvantaged backgrounds, obviously with a focus on gender equality through skateboarding and education. But how do we know that we're doing this? It's not how many students pass through our doors. We need, more evidence to show that our students learned this and that. Our students increase their skills in this area and that area. Our students increase their personal feelings here and there. We need a way to show the quality of our programs, to show that, yes, our students are learning maths and maybe Khmer or Dari, depending on the location, but they're also learning about mental health, menstrual health, life skills, career, etc. So yeah, putting a wider scope on programs that we deliver. And we do this, so at the beginning, we were just taking registration for students. We were just understanding the background of where they came from, the income of their family. But as we've developed through Skateistan, for the past maybe 4 to 5 years, we've been steadily increasing our MEL department. And it's gone from kind of strength to strength. But originally taking basic information for the students, we have now developed into taking information on well-being, feelings of safety, feelings of confidence, opening up areas for qualitative responses. So personal feedback, individual feedback. It's really developed in a way that, on one hand, yes, we have the accountability for donors, we have the accountability for the organization, but we also have a chance to look at the feedback from the participants themselves. And to understand where we go. The evaluation. How do we start? Back to examples of monitoring. So within monitoring, we have quantitative data, which is the data that refers to the number of students we have, exactly how many students, how many females, how many people from low income backgrounds. We also have attendance, the number of people who pass through the programs, and we also have surveys that give numerical values on the programs and the students' feedback. Then we move on to qualitative data, which relates to the narrative. It supports the numbers in the form of stories that our stakeholders have shared with us, the experience the children have had while they're in our programs. And this can take the form of interviews and quotes, photos and videos, focus groups with the students, and yeah, it can also be demonstrated in blog posts and reports and discussions. This can also, both are as important as the other, using different forms of data. But by using different forms of data collection, this allows us to paint the picture of our programs and to explain more in a sentence. We can dive into it and explain more for potential donors, existing donors, supporters. And yeah, moving on to examples of evaluation, assessing and interpreting this data. So question 1, how do you know the quality is good? And this relates to process evaluation. So checking the process of how we've delivered our programs, understanding how we've implemented our programs. Have we delivered on our programs? Did they do what we intended to do? Have they ended up doing something completely different? That may also be positive. There's many different outcomes to how they could go. But yeah, this process is to understand, did you deliver on the programs in the way that you intended? Moving on to the second question, which is, are participants benefiting in the way that you hope they will? This looks at the impacts and the outcomes of the program, and can the changes in the participants be attributed to the program or the intervention that you've delivered? Have they experienced well-being by joining your programs, or is it aside another influence? This is important to be able to show, say, yes, we did A, it created B, and the stakeholder benefited, delivered C. So yeah, and this is very valuable for donor reporting, annual reports, meetings, success stories of your program, and also strategic planning moving forward to understand where to change, where to sustain. And that brings us into the example of learning. So learning gives the questions, as we can see, what can we change or do better based on the new information that we have? This relates to programs, planning and design, trainings, quality control checks. Are we failing take Skateistan for an example. If we do an assessment and we figure out that a particular bunch of male students at the same age are not benefiting and not reaching the same scores as others in feelings of well-being, maybe we can take a look. Maybe we work with the national staff to see, maybe there's an outside influence, maybe there's something in there, maybe there's a community issue at hand. But it's vitally important to understand this so we can address it and try to improve the programs to address these matters with the students. And then implementing these findings, using the data from questionnaire analysis to inform programs planning and budgeting as well, can really benefit the sustainability of your program. You can understand where the budgeting is necessary, where it needs to be planned or addressed. And above all, the accountability, doing what you say you're going to do, to the participants and community, to the organization, and to the donors, is very important to prove that, yes, you delivered us this and we succeeded by doing that. And yeah, hopefully that gave a broad overview to the introduction to MEL. And we'll now hear from Leanne, and I will pass the mic over.
Thanks, Niall. Great. So I've been asked to chat a little bit about my experience. I don't really like the title expert because I feel like I've always got a lot more to learn, but I'll take it in this forum. So I'm going to chat a little bit about my learnings and my experience in the field. In the sector. So just to give you a little bit of background about me, who I am, where I come from. So I'm South African based, and I started off in the evaluation space, I'll call it, as a consultant doing monitoring and evaluation work for government, NGOs, private organizations in South Africa. And then I moved into the sport for development space, which is how I've come to know some of the lovely people we find ourselves in the company of today. So I worked in that space for a little bit of time, and now I'm working in the public health space, so in HIV prevention programs. So I guess I've seen an array of different things, and so I'm kind of drawing on insights from all of this to chat to you today. And I think it is going to be quite an informal conversation, I hope, with conversation being the primary word there. And I always, whenever I get to talk to groups, I always like to start with a bit of a cartoon or a comic. So that's what I've splashed up on the screen here. So I'm going to give everyone like 2 seconds just to have a look at it and digest it, hopefully laugh about it. And then we can chat. I'm going to just tell you what it means for me and how I interpret it. So have a look at it. So I suppose the crux of it is what the person at the bottom is saying, sitting at the table. They're saying every big idea looks silly when you put it down on paper, right? And I would hope that this can resonate with you, whether you're on the MEL or MEL end of the spectrum, if you're more about the program end of the spectrum, so putting your big idea into action and putting it onto paper. But I suppose what monitoring and evaluation and learning forces us to do is to concretize these ideas, right, and to put them on a piece of paper. And I think the cartoon makes a point about what MEL can do for us and how it helps us to actually break down and unpack this concept of this often very important social change that we're trying to address. And so here it's maybe a big goal of world hunger, but we can kind of see what they're trying to do. We can maybe see that there's a couple of steps missing there, but we get the gist of it. And I think MEL is a really powerful tool to help us to unpack our work. And so that's really the sort of angle and lens that I'm coming at this from. Cool, if we can go to the next slide, please. So to get you engaged, I would love to hear from you in the chat. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about a MEL plan, a MEL system, a MEL framework? And if none of those terms are familiar to you, just what comes to mind when you think about MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning? So I think we'll give it like 2 minutes for everyone to pop some things. I'm going to call out as I go. Okay, control, cost benefit analysis, stress, very stressful, yes. Yeah, data collection was the first one. I think control is really interesting. Observing, okay. Excel sheets, okay. Questionnaires, yeah. Test scores. Okay, so a lot like a very controlling, numbers-based, quantitative quite theme coming through here. How your organization can do better, understanding, tracking down and engaging stakeholders once, twice removed. Okay, impact, stories and case studies, nice. Change is great. Funding, yes, unfortunately. Okay, give it one more second and then we can move on. But I mean, essentially, like all correct, right? I mean, these are all things that we come across in this landscape. It was kind of just to get a sense of where everyone's at. And I see there are definitely some people sitting on the side, looking up at this big MEL mountain being like, oh my gosh, how do I tackle this? And then other people who are in it, and I can see you've got, some of the concepts down. So great, I think all correct. Thank you. That's helpful to just get a mix of the room. So yeah, in terms of what I think we mean when we talk about a MEL plan or a system or a framework, I think just to say that these are all synonyms of each other. I know some of the real sticklers for technicality would like to say different, but honestly, it's all the same. It's basically a collection or a kind of amalgamation of guiding documents or ways of structuring information that helps to guide us on the practices and the processes that allow us to collect systematic and effective data. It also tells us how we can use that data by using it through analysis. And it does it both for monitoring and evaluation. So it's really like the how, the practice and the process, which I'll talk to in a second. And then from that how, it kind of should help us, your plan or your framework should help you to break down the activities that we need to undertake before, during, and after the program to track and measure our progress. And hopefully, fingers crossed, if everything went right, the success of achieving whatever it is that our program has as a goal or has as its objective. So essentially, when we talk about the SMEL system or the SMEL framework, it's kind of telling us, it's kind of guiding us on the who. So who are we collecting data from? Who's doing the data collection? Who's doing the capturing of the data? Who's doing the analysis of the data? So all of that the arm of responsibility. How are we doing it? Are we doing it through quantitative methods? And I'll spoke more about how Skateistan is moving into some of the qualitative aspects of data collection. Are we doing it on paper-based tools? Are we using big, scary Excel sheets to capture things? Are we using really intuitive, like mobile devices? Are we recording videos of people and trying to analyze those? How is it happening? Is it happening in person? Are we doing it virtually? That type of thing. When is it happening? Do we do it every day because we're running sessions every day and we're taking attendance every day? Are we checking in with our participants in an interview and a focus group every week, every month? Are we only doing it when our quarterly report rolls around and we've just suddenly got to pull out our data together and show our donor, yeah, hey, we did something this quarter. How often is it happening? When is it happening? And I think most importantly, and that's why it's capitalized, and so what? What are we doing with that data? Are we actually, do we look at it after we've put it together in the big quarterly report? Do we look at it weekly? How do we take that data back to our teams? How do we discuss it with them? But I think for me, time and time again in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning space, the question is always, so what? Why are we doing this? And what does it mean? So that's, yeah, I think in a nutshell, what I think the MEL plan system or framework should do. I'm not going to get into too much technicality because I think Ruby will take us through some of that, and Mbali and Niall as well. So if we can move on to the next slide. So like I've spoken about, I suppose, some of my experience, and I suppose I come from a space where I've helped to design these frameworks, these plans from scratch. I've helped to intervene when it's not going well. I've helped to evaluate the frameworks. So I kind of seen them from all angles. And I think particularly when we're not looking at the donor space, so when we're looking at MEL in an internal program space, what matters is that there's no right or wrong framework or system or set of indicators or way for doing this. It should work in a way that is functional on the ground, so it works for the people who have to use it in the context in which they work. And I suppose an example here is, there's no point in us designing a really fancy system that's got loads of, mobile devices or collecting I suppose really just offhand, the one example I can think of is people thinking that we can give coaches cell phones and that they can go and collect data from kids. They get out onto the soccer field, they get out into the settings in which they're delivering these programs. It's really unsafe and they can't collect that data. So that's just like a misalignment between this wonderful MEL system or way of collecting data and what's actually happening on the ground. So that's why I suppose what I'm trying to say is it must work for the people who have to use it, because if the people at the bottom level of the system can't do it, it's just not going to work for anyone above that. So logical is sort of speaking to how it needs to make sense. Like we need to understand that one thing leads to another, but also it needs to be practical and feasible for the context in which it's implemented. I thought it was really great that Niall spoke about the donors, the program, the participants, and I kind of see these as like dependencies. And sometimes you've got really in the space overbearing donors, and we have to kind of fulfill those objectives. Sometimes we don't have donors, or donors are not a problem, and we can just design and measure things for ourselves. Sometimes it's a bit of a balancing act between the two. It sounds like that's how it is for Skateistan. You see Mbali is nodding. So yeah, I think it's about figuring out a way that it works for you and not, I suppose, being too tied down by one thing or another. And then I think always, if I could do things differently, I would start simple. So starting with the absolute basics and planning or designing or working on my monitoring and evaluation system with use in mind. And by use, I mean how it's the so what question. What are we going to do with this data? How are we going to use it? Who's going to use it? How often? If we're only producing something for a quarterly report for a donor, I mean, it's useful for the donor, but how useful is it for us? And I think that sort of a common mistake or a common pitfall organizations find themselves in when they're designing their monitoring and evaluation systems is they feel like they need to build everything, like build this huge system with all of these indicators and all of their outcomes and all of the things and like 25 different data collection tools. And then they have to measure it all, but they've got like one person who can do that. And it's like, it's impossible. It's impossible. So I think we should see flexibility in that process, and that it's okay to design elaborately, but then we need to know that we have to prioritize certain things. So even though we've got a big framework, let's still start with the basics and let's see how that goes. And once we've got like level 1 down, we can progress to level 2 and sort of a prioritizing, or let's build as we go. So let's build the basics, measure the basics, see how that goes, which kind of sounds like what Niall was describing earlier, and that's been Skateistan's path. Okay. So like building as you go. And I really feel like that's, it comes down to capacity really. And I mean, capacity in terms of number of people, capacity in terms of, do program staff have time to do monitoring and evaluation together with actually implementing their program? Do they understand why they need to do it? Do we all understand why we need to do it? Capacity within the organization to use that information, because if everyone's running around on the ground collecting this, but it's not actually filtering up into the right channels, again, there's really no point in doing it. So yeah, starting simple, building from like a solid, simple structure upwards, I think is really important. And a lot of the time I find that that's kind of the undoing that needs to happen before we can start putting something solid together. And then I think the last point I've sort of spoken to, but I'll speak to it again, is that there's really no point in having really elaborate and beautifully designed systems if you can't feasibly measure what you need to measure. So if, for example, you need to give a child a survey every week, like there's going to be survey fatigue. People are just like, I don't want to fill out a question every single week. I come here to skate. I come here to play sport. I come here to do whatever I need to do. I don't want to be shoved with this piece of paper in my face every single week. So if you can't feasibly measure the things, rather just don't measure them at all, or find a different way to measure them. And then again, it's just this, I think I'll probably harp on about this point of use, because honestly, it's the most terrible thing I see is the information not being used to make decisions, and people work so hard to collect this huge bulk of information, put it together, put it beautifully in all of the graphs and charts, and trust me, we spend time choosing our color palettes and doing everything to make sure it looks great, and then it's just not used for anything. Like at the senior levels of an organization, or even in programmatic levels of an organization, it's just not used to make any decisions. Even though it's like very, very valuable information. So those are some of my learnings and reflections on sort of MAL systems and practices. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, now it's your turn. So we're going to put up a little poll, which is asking you 3 questions. The one is whether you know what a theory of change is, whether your organization has a theory of change, and whether you've been involved in developing a theory of change. So if everyone can let us know what their experience has been. I don't think I can see when it's coming in, but I can see the results.
Okay, we still have some results rolling in, and at the moment we've got 59% of the group saying they are aware of what a theory of change is, which is great. Awesome. But 65% of the organizations don't have one.
Okay, and then majority of people haven't been involved in developing a theory of change before.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So a bit of a mixed bag. Okay, so just to say, I suppose that leads us into the next section, and surprise, surprise, we'll be talking about a theory of change. So most people know what it is, but I'll give you my take on how I think it's defined. But I was asked to address the question, is a theory of change important? And so the short answer is yes, it's very important. And I'll tell you why in a second, but let's first define or just talk about what a theory of change is for those who haven't heard about it. So essentially, and I know it sounds like a technical or complicated term, it's really not. A theory of change is an organization's theory or their story about how they bring change into the world. So it really should be tackling the nuts and bolts, or like the sort of gears and cogs in the system of how change happens. Personally, I enjoy a lot of detail in a theory of change, so really explicitly defining how one thing leads to another. And essentially it's like building blocks. So that's why I've got my little Lego pieces at the bottom of the slide, but it explains an organization's beliefs about how change will unfold and how the world, people, communities will be different because of their work. And we call the sort of fruits of your labor, I suppose, the results, or if we want to name it something, your outcomes or your impact. And so it's essentially, the reason why I have the Lego blocks is the theory of change is really kind of, I see it as a diagram or visual explanation of how change occurs. And we start building right the way from activities. So you saw in that initial slide, we had their activity, which was their school lunch program. Sorry, I think they called it lunch subsidy program. And then the theory of change essentially like takes us through the building blocks of how we eventually arrive at our ending world hunger stage. So it's really those causal mechanisms and the things that it helps us to say, if we do this, then this will happen, and that'll lead to this thing, and this will eventually get us to our final sort of destination, which is our result. You can go into the next slide, please. Okay, so I said I'd talk about why it's important, and I think I've articulated this already, but it really explains very clearly why and how our program or our interventions logic should work. And so I'll just let you have a look at that cartoon again. But essentially it's a presenter and she's trying to present her theory of change, and the panel who's looking at it doesn't really understand what's going on in step 2. And so they're asking, please could they provide a little more detail, please could the presenter provide a little bit more detail on step 2. And so the question mark there is essentially what in evaluation we would call the program's black box. And so, you know, there's the black box, which is the thing which is put into airplanes. And sometimes when an airplane crashes, all of the data and the recordings, everything is stored on this airplane's black box. And when you open up the black box, you can understand what happened in like the crash, or what might have gone wrong with the airplane and why it faulted, or why something happened. And so the question mark, or when we have a bit of a vagueness in understanding of how a program works, we call it the program theory black box. And so until the black box is unpacked, or until it's opened up, if a program fails, so if the airplane crashes, we don't know why, because we can't see inside the black box. And if it works, we don't know why either. If it flew and everything went fine, unless we understand the reasoning for that, we can't know. But MEL, or monitoring, evaluation, and learning, can really help us to understand this. I'm just trying to think about whether to unpack this. So essentially, let's take an example of like menstrual hygiene. So girls' menstrual hygiene program, where we say to girls, come into our program, we're going to give you menstrual hygiene products, whatever those might be. And somehow we expect, or the outcome that we want to achieve, our big impact that we want to achieve is girls' grades improve at school. Girls are doing much better at school. And we present this to people and everything's looking wonderful. And someone wants to know, but how did you do it? Because I actually want to take your program and I want to replicate it somewhere else. And we haven't unpacked what the mechanisms or what the causal reasons are for why better grades at school are associated with menstrual hygiene products. And so that's essentially the black box. We can't unpack it. And there could be a multitude of reasons, right? Menstrual hygiene products mean that girls spend less time away from school, so they're attending school more often, therefore their grades improve. It could be something to do with self-confidence. It could be a host of different things that ultimately, either together or in isolation, lead to this kind of change that we're seeing. And so really laying out the reasoning for your program is really important. Not only does it allow us to actually test how this happens in reality, and if it's wrong, we can change it, but it also allows us to unpack it and to be able to apply it to other situations. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So I suppose I've also had quite a bit of experience facilitating the process of developing a theory of change with organizations in multiple different spaces. And so I was asked to share some tips that I have on starting the process. I suppose this is applicable to starting it, but also during the process, some of these might be applicable as well. So if your organization doesn't have a theory of change, or it's got a really outdated theory of change that needs updating, or just generally needs relooking, the best advice I could give is to include all levels of the organization in its development or in its revision. I think most importantly, senior management, or people who have the biggest decision-making power, but also who need to have the most buy-in in theory of change. It really doesn't help the organization if everyone at a program level, everyone who's actually implementing the intervention really believes in the theory of change and really understands the theory of change, but then the people who sort of maybe liaise with funders or who promote the program are totally disconnected from that. So yeah, the process of involving everyone in the development of a theory of change is extremely important. I can't emphasize that enough. I think it's organizationally dependent, but sometimes it's important to think about whether you would want to facilitate that process with someone internally. If someone internally has the capacity or the skill to do that, it's great. I have found a lot of the time it's helpful to have an external person facilitate the theory of change. It can often be quite a political process. People are very tied to the work that they've done in an organization. A lot of time there's years and years of thinking about what type of program should we do that's going to get children to do this, or what's the best way to change someone's behavior. And people are very emotionally tied to work that they've done, even though it might not always make sense in the current context, or for several reasons. So sometimes it can be really helpful to have a sort of third party external person who's a bit more impartial to the ideas within an organization and can help to guide people through the process rather than, and when I say political, I suppose I mean it can be a fight. Some of the times it can be a very confrontational process to speak about why my organization does what it does and how it's going to achieve that. So yeah, it's just something to consider. Sometimes it is really helpful to have an external person. If I've done it as an internal person in an NGO before, and that was okay too. I suppose it's just about how that facilitator plays the role and the hats that they wear in the organization. So that's something to consider that can really help or hinder the process. And then I think most importantly, whether you're starting on the journey of developing your theory of change, or whether you already have a theory of change, is that it's a living document. And I think this, and we'll come full circle with this, but I think this really speaks to learning, and that as soon as we learn something, we need to make changes. And often the theory of change is a test. It's just a theory about how change might happen. And when we realize, oh, okay, one method of, this is just an example, but like one method of one type of menstrual hygiene product works better than another, we need to change that in our theory of change, and we need to say, like, this is the direction we're going, or we've learned that this doesn't work and we're stopping this side of the program. So it really should be a living document. It shouldn't be something that's, I mean, it shouldn't be something that's changing daily, but it certainly should be something that's being updated with learning, and that's feeding into the cycle of how we progressing and developing as an organization. So that's theory of change. If we can move to the next slide, I think we start speaking about learning. Learning is a bit of a tough one, because I think that this is not as formalized as the M and the E in the MEL conundrum. So I'm going to speak about limited experience, I suppose, of when learning works well. So I think the best experience I've had of really learning was within peer-to-peer or cross-organizational learning networks. So it could be a group of organizations in a specific sector, so like sport for development. It could be a group of organizations in a different sector that are all trying to tackle the same problem. So it could be like mental health in adolescents and youth, or it could just be a broader organization, like a broader thing of like NGOs in a specific geography, like in Cape Town or in South Africa or something like that. But where there's commonalities in the work that you do. And I think people who are open about sharing their data, their results, their pitfalls, a lot of the time learning is about what didn't work well, and how we learned how to change that. And so I think a peer-to-peer kind of, I suppose it's more of a horizontal flat structure of learning where there's less of a power dynamic. So it's not me and my manager trying to learn, or me trying to learn with senior management. It's kind of a sort of more equal structure. I found that to be really helpful in the past. The second point is around actually having feasible learnings or recommendations about how to improve. So if someone's like, oh yeah, we can fix X, Y, and Z problem if we had like another $1 million, like, you know, is that really going to happen? What's something that's actually feasible that could actually be implemented? And that's practical for the program as well. There's no point in coming into a learning space with kind of like wild ideas. It needs to be quite focused and moderated for the context. And then I think, again, we can have these wonderful networks and we can have all of these wonderful ideas, but if I go to an organizational meeting and I come back, or if I go to a meeting with another organization, I come back to my organization, I'm like, hey, we've got this really wonderful idea, and everyone at the organization is like, nah, you know, it's okay. There's no capacity and there's no support in my organization for me to drive that change or for me to drive that learning. It makes it really difficult for that learning to stick and to take place. So I think it's really about thinking about how do we capacitate and support each other to make these changes happen, or to bring in learnings from other organizations or from whatever places we find them, and to put, you know, to sort of implement them in the programs that we're working with. So that's learning. And I think my last slide is just speaking about a little bit about evaluation. So what should organizations consider if they want to evaluate their programs in future? So I think first and foremost, it's what's the reason that you want to do an evaluation? Are you just doing this as a tick box requirement? So you're just ticking a box to say to your donor, yes, I evaluated the program. It's not, there's no shame in doing that. I mean, it has to be done from time to time. I've been a part of many of those evaluations and they're totally okay. But the chances of you really learning something from the results of that evaluation or from the recommendations are probably quite low. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's important to do evaluations when you understand how the results of the evaluation are going to be used, which I suppose I'm speaking now to my third point. So I'll just address it, where you understand how the evaluation findings and recommendations will be used. If there's no process to say this is what this information will do for us as an organization, there's absolutely no point in using it. there's no point in commissioning an evaluation or paying for an evaluation if the report just sits in your files, in your computer, gathering dust, or on your Google Drive, and it's never opened, and it's like, Leanne saved this 3 years ago and hasn't opened it since. It's a big problem. And there was really little to no reason for doing that evaluation. So just examining why you're doing the evaluation and what you can get out of it. And the reason I say that speaks to my second point is because evaluations are expensive, and or they can be expensive. I suppose you pay for what you get, but it's a lot of work and a lot of effort that goes into them. And so it's really important that we make sure we get the best use out of them as possible. And then I think, just speaking to the first point, the first section of the second point, the valuability of your program. So if your program is kind of new and in its infancy, and it doesn't have a whole lot of data, and maybe it doesn't have a whole lot of people or participants, sometimes it's less valuable to do an evaluation at that stage. It doesn't mean it's not valuable. There are certain types of evaluation that can be done. But just thinking about the types of data that your program's collecting, the types of data you can make available to an evaluator or to someone internally who might do the evaluation. There's external and internal evaluation that can be done. But yeah, just understanding what's available and the feasibility or the valuability of your program. You know, if you've been running for 2 months and you commission an evaluator and you want to be like, tell me whether I ended world poverty, probably unlikely. So just to have that kind of, yeah, reality check in mind. I think that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was amazing. Thank you for all your input. And if there's any questions for Leanne, I've noted 1 or 2 questions that we can discuss at the end of this, sort of at the end of the last presentation. So we'll have Ruby coming up next. And so we're funneling this down, right? So we had a very big overview about monitoring and evaluation. We introduced it. We funneled it down to the specifics from Leanne. And now we're going to get even more specific, and we're going to talk about MEL on a budget. And I think this will resonate with a lot of the sort of smaller NGOs or smaller social skate projects that are implementing their MEL without a big budget to work with. So we'll pass the mic on to Ruby, who will introduce us to how they were doing MEL at Free Movement Skateboarding.
Yeah, hi everyone, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Ruby. I'm one of the co-founders of Free Movement Skateboarding, which is a social skateboarding charity based in Athens, Greece. We work with local and displaced communities to aid social inclusion, gender equity, and physical and mental well-being. So yeah, as Mbali just said, I'm gonna, oh sorry, Rihanna's telling me that my mic's a bit bad. Do you want me to? Okay, can you hear me better now? Cool, okay. Sorry about that. I hope you heard my introduction. Yeah, so I'm going to speak about things from more of a practical side to kind of back up some of the theory that we've heard already. So yeah, as has already been outlined in this talk, for many organizations and projects, our goals and the overall impact that we're trying to achieve are not things that are easily measured or quantified. So gender equity, for example, we can monitor quite easily and report with numbers over time, whereas things like empowerment and improved mental health and sort of like overall well-being, like they're much harder to monitor. So I want to try and show like a few methods that we can use in order to stay just kind of better tuned into like participant satisfaction, well-being, the effectiveness of our programs, and therefore the impact that we're having over time. So yeah, I'm going to present a few like simple ways that you can collect meaningful data and feedback from the outset of a social skateboarding project. So in terms of like money and time, hopefully these methods, like once you've set them up, they would just become part of your weekly schedule, and you can often complete them within the sessions, so they're very achievable even with limited capacity. Cool, so yeah, can you change the slide please, Rihanna? So as, oh yeah, perfect. As Leanne just outlined, In the first stages of designing a project, it's extremely useful to create a problem tree or a log frame or a theory of change. This helps to create the narrative for your work and to identify the issue or the issues within the context that you work in, the causes and the effects of these, and of course, how your project will work to address them and therefore create a positive impact over time. So, for example, with free movement skateboarding, the focal problem we identified, which gave motivation for the creation of our project, is the poor quality of life for displaced people living in Athens. So we outlined some of the core causes of this as traumatic life experiences, prolonged stress, unstable living situations, living in isolated refugee camps, lack of access to educational or recreational services, with the effects of this being perhaps behavioral issues, loneliness, isolation, disempowerment, lack of opportunities, intolerance, safety issues, especially for girls and women. So as you can see, after identifying the various effects of the social climate in Athens, we have our three main goals, which we hope to work towards with our skateboarding and creative programs. So we have mental health and well-being, social inclusion and gender equity as our three main things. Yeah, so once you've identified the focal problem or problems, then you can set your specific goals and therefore design your MEL framework so that the data you collect can be measured up against your predicted outcomes. This data over time is ideal to include in funding applications, but also for internal use, to be monitored for monthly reports, overall strategy, and improving programs and your student well-being and satisfaction. Yeah, next slide, please, Brianna. Cool, so on this slide, we can see an example of a theory of change that I did a couple of years ago. To be honest, now that I've been reviewing it for this talk, I would do quite a few things differently, but I thought it would be useful to include anyway, just as an example. As Leanne said, this is like a living framework, which you're supposed to kind of adapt as you grow. So yeah, after the problem tree, this kind of breaks things down to show how your programs or activities will create the outcomes that will hopefully achieve your goals and the larger impact down the line. So if we use one of the problems that FMS, Free Movement, has outlined in Athens of disempowered girls and women, then your solutions to that could be creation of safe spaces, specific outreach, partnering with other organizations or groups focused on women's empowerment, having a diverse team, and perhaps girls or women's only sessions. So the outcomes of this would hopefully be increased attendance of girls and women, increased confidence and self-esteem over time, new friendships, with the greater impact being changed attitudes towards girls and women's participation in skateboarding or sport, or on a local level and more broadly, the creation of positive role models and gender parity within your sessions and hopefully the local skate community as well. So yeah, we also have a log frame that I made. I haven't included it in this presentation because for some reason I decided to do all of these methods. And if anyone's interested to see it, I can send it afterwards. But because I saw a question on here earlier as well, it's I see it as much as the same as these two methods, but ours was kind of even more detailed as it included the objectively verifiable indicators and also sources of verification. For example, with the intended outcome being empowered women, you could have an indicator monitoring maybe if they joined other community groups after attending your sessions, or testimonials that they have made new friends and thus feel more confident to enter public skate parks or something like this. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, next slide, please. Perfect. So on to things that you can do once your sessions get started. I cannot stress enough how important it is to start collecting data from the very first session or workshop. This was mentioned in the talk before about fundraising as well. Even if there are just like 1 or 2 people attending, like at first, this will only back you up in the future to show how much you've grown and progressed. So the thing to do is to create registers for every session, and to make sure that these registers, that they reflect the goals that you're trying to achieve. So, for example, if your focus is on increased accessibility for disabled people, then just make sure that you're monitoring that and evaluating the data, you know, at least every quarter or ideally every month. So this is an example of one that we use, and ours is more kind of focused on nationality and gender, but also about like attendance and like returning participants for consistency as well. So yeah, so with free movement, like from the outset, we were preparing reports for our main donor every month, and this was actually super useful. It made sure that we were kind of reviewing our data and our practices regularly, so we could kind of tangibly see the ways that we were kind of needing to adjust or do extra outreach. So on this slide, this is just to show you a quick example of some very basic graphs that I gathered after our first 6 months of operations in Athens. And although these are like just super simple, like they actually give us many great indicators of the goals that we were working towards and also the ones that we need to improve on. So if you look at the left chart and graph, this is from our workshops, which we held twice a week in a refugee camp. Obviously, the goals here are more focused on gender equity and physical and mental well-being. And you can see that the participation of girls went up, and like general participation goes up as well. So that's like really great. We were sticking to those goals. There was good consistency. So hopefully with people coming over time, then well-being is improving. If you look to on the right, we have the data from one of our open sessions, which we hold in a basketball court in the center of Athens. So as well as well-being, the main focus here is social cohesion. And as we can see from the pie chart, we have a mixture of different nationalities, which in time has diversified even more. Like I think today we have about 20 different nationalities enrolled in this session. So yeah, but as you can see, in this chart, the participation of girls and women, for example, is not so high. So it was great to look at that and see like, okay, this is very diverse in terms of nationalities, but we have, you know, we've got to do some extra outreach, for example. So even if it's not giving you the answers you want for now, it's like there's things to work on. Cool. Yeah. Next slide, please. And then another really valuable method that you can do from the very beginning is completing session debriefs. And there's a template of the one that we use. This is not something that we were actually using at Free Movement from the start, but I really wish we had, because it's such a great way to check in with the team and or partner projects and gather useful information whilst it's fresh in your minds, like literally right after you've done the session or the workshop. So as you can see, ours include like positive outcomes from the session, observations of students' moods, progress, behavior, challenges we faced, any incidents that occurred, and ideas for the upcoming sessions. So we would then like take all because we do many different sessions, we would then gather them all and we would review all of these debriefs at our weekly team meetings. And not only then would we have ways to constantly like adapt and improve our sessions based on participants, like staff and partners' feedback, but we also had like quotes, testimonials, positive outcomes to mention like on social media or to collate for monthly reports to donors or funding applications. Cool, yeah, the next slide is kind of just a few other ideas because I don't really have time to speak about everything, but here it's like focus groups as well. Mood charts are something that we haven't ever used, but I was thinking it's like a really nice, accessible visual way to check in with participants' moods kind of before and after the session. So yeah, and then feedback booklets. I will show you a little bit in the next slides. Cool. So this is something that takes like a little bit longer to put together, but it's a really great thing to use like quarterly or perhaps just once or twice a year. The tricky part for us was always like translating it into many different languages. So that was like the time consuming bit. But you can also just make sure the language is like really simple and, you know, have like partner projects assist or, you know, kind of guide people through it. But we usually had it in like 4 different languages at least. And you can really just design these surveys like any way that you want. You could just include like closed questions to gain definite data like people's age, gender, etc. But we were gathering all this data for our registers anyway, so we tended to use like a mixture of open and closed questions to gain a varied understanding. So yeah, simple closed questions like have you made any new friends, and open ones such as like let us know what we can do to make you feel safer in our sessions. Then from this, we'll have information for reports and funding apps like 90 out of 100, for example, or 90% of students said that they made more than one friend through skateboarding in our workshops, or 88% of students who attended weekly sessions said they felt more confident and strong after participating for 6 months. So not only are you learning and gathering like really valuable feedback, but you also have like this wonderful data. So it works very well. Cool, yeah, that's there's just another page of the feedback booklet. I'm also happy to send this to anyone. We have in a few different languages. And yeah, that's about it from me. I just wanted to say like, definitely don't hesitate to get in touch or to ask any advice or talk more about these topics. We're really, really happy to share knowledge and resources. Like free movement wouldn't be where it's like a tool without the help of other skateboarding organizations, like especially Skateistan and SkatePal. So like we're really here to like keep the exchange going and to keep learning from others as much as sharing. So yeah, really get in touch if there's much more to share. There's just not really time. So
thank you so much, Ruby. I think one of the things that I can also sort of recommend or suggest, maybe not recommend, is that we can establish some kind of a Goodpush MEL community of practice where we can use regular meetings, maybe once a month or once every 2 months, to check in and learn from each other about our MEL activities. I think that would definitely be helpful for a lot of us. I'm part of a learning community and I'm still learning. In our MEL, I'm learning from other organizations on how to implement certain things. So I think that could definitely be a way for us to remain connected in this community of MEL practitioners. All right, so the next slide is just a little bit of some information from, Amelia says, yes, let's do it. It's just a little bit of a lessons learned slide. We put 6 notes up there, which is lessons that we've learned as a team working in MEL for Skateistan. Obviously, our MEL has started from the bare bones to what it is now, but there's definitely a lot of things that we've learned throughout the years. I'll make a point and I'll ask Niall and Cindy to just add if there's anything to add. We'll try to keep it short so that we also leave some time for any questions from you guys. So the first point that I wanted to talk about is the fact that more is not always better. And I think this is something that has been mentioned a number of times throughout this workshop.
Does the biggest tell the smallest, or does the smallest tell the biggest?
I'm sorry, I'm in a meeting. The smallest tells the biggest. Sorry about that, everyone. I thought I closed the door. But so we currently collect data on a little over 15 indicators for a variety of donors. We use focus groups, we track attendance daily, we track attendance monthly, weekly. We have weekly reports that feed into monthly reports. We have educator observations. We use baseline and endline questionnaires for multiple programs. And then we also have stories of growth that we collect throughout the year. And that's a lot of data collection. And it has taken us a lot of time to get into this position. Even we as an organization get overwhelmed with the level of data we are collecting and how granular it can be sometimes. So sometimes keeping it simple is best. We are looking at how we can go back to simplifying things for ourselves and not have so much granular data. In terms of diversifying your data collection, I know it kind of is counterintuitive to say less is more is not better, but then diversify. What this means is that you can simplify a questionnaire, make it shorter, but then what you can also do is triangulate your data with another form of an activity. So you have a 3-question questionnaire, it's really brief, kids are happy to answer it, and to get more information that you didn't get from the questionnaire, you potentially then use a focus group to triangulate that data, or you use a story of growth to triangulate that same data, so that you don't end up with a 12-question questionnaire where you can actually just use different forms of MEL to get a well-rounded picture of what you're trying to understand. In terms of the organization and improving our use of learning, it just speaks to how you use your data internally and not just solely for the purposes of donor reporting. At the moment, we use a lot of the information we collect to report to our donors, but we need to look at how we're going to close that learning cycle and improve on that. So how are we going to take what we learn in our analysis and feed it back into our programs? How do we get our participants themselves? We're accountable to them, right? So how do we get them to see the results of their own questionnaires? We keep asking them all these questions, but they never see where it goes. So we also, as an organization, are learning that we can improve on how we feed back to our programs, how we feed back to our students, our parents that are part of the programs as well. And also just for everyone to understand why we collect the data we collect, how important it is and what it means to them to see that information. I think it's also important to make sure that educators see this analysis as well, or your coaches to see this analysis, because then you can develop action plans on how to improve in the areas that need improvement, but also just to celebrate where you are strong, what areas you are strong in. And that means that if a coach knows that students are unhappy because of something, they can work on that. Or if a coach knows that they're doing really well because a student trusts them, they know that they've done a good job. They've been a caring coach in that environment. The fourth one is to err is human. We all make mistakes. And I think I don't have money. Leanne made an example about like, maybe you have a report and you quickly have to collect data and you forgot about something, and that does happen. Even when you're a well-established organization, you do find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, this is the wrong indicator, or oh my gosh, this is the wrong log frame. We have an updated log frame. We submitted this to the donor, not this. These things happen. What helps is to have a lot of people checking each other up, or basically backing each other up and making sure that it's not just one set of eyes looking at data, because you can get lost in numbers, you can get lost in a table or a log frame, and it always helps to have somebody who can work with you, work alongside you. Your colleagues can help you remember certain things that you may have forgotten about. The participatory approach when designing MEL speaks to the beginning process. Who do you involve when you design your MEL system? Who do you involve when you're designing questions? How do you gather those questions? It's very helpful to involve as many stakeholders as possible when you're designing your MEL system. So if you know that you want to ask students questions about well-being in your questionnaire, it's okay to ask them, what would you like me to ask you about this program? Why do you come here? Why do you think it's, like things that engage them, so that when you're going back and you're saying, okay, here's my questionnaire, they can answer those questions. They feel like they were part of that process. You can involve parents. Parents are such a big resource when it comes to understanding kids in the community that you work in, because they live with those children. And they can help you. Okay, parents, what is it that you want us to be doing with your students that we haven't necessarily thought about? Maybe they want us to be looking at a specific language that the children are struggling with. So we can add that to a questionnaire. We can add that to a focus group discussion. We can include the stakeholders that are involved in the program in designing that process. And we can also include more staff in collecting data. It's not just the responsibilities of that one MEL person who has to run around and advocate for MEL or run around and collect data. It should be that everybody understands the importance of monitoring and evaluation so that everybody is involved in that data collection. I think as an example at Skateistan, a lot of our educators go for MEL workshops regularly with MEL educators so that when we are collecting data, we know that we can ask other colleagues, other team members to assist in that data collection process. If you have to collect 30 surveys, can't do it alone, it's going to take longer. So if you inform your team about what your MEL system is, what it involves, why you're collecting this data, it suddenly halves the work for you. The sixth one, I'm going to let Niall talk about because he's very passionate about planning MEL from start to finish.
Thanks, Mbali. I feel like a bit of an imposter coming in the very, very last part. But yeah, it's also maybe more to just self-admission of my mistake. Where when we were designing questionnaires, we involved like obviously a lot of the MEL educators, a lot of the staff, and it was really, really great, really like innovative. We had a lot of energy within the discussion. But I was like at that time, as our MEL department was growing, I was creating the questionnaires and then analyzing it. And yeah, this point is from my own experience, I didn't think about analysis at all when I was designing the questionnaire and laying out the format. So when I did, we had these like these questionnaires that had taken the staff, I think about 40 minutes, I think Mbali touched on it, about 40 minutes to complete with one student, which is a long time to pay attention for, even for myself. And then at the end, I was left with amazing data, and like we really dove into a lot of different areas and people gave their own sense. But yeah, it was like just a mess. Like, it was just so different. I had like lines of, there was like a Likert scale of 1 to 5, followed by a yes/no question, followed by a multiple choice, followed by another Likert, and like it was like a minority report trying to bring them all around and put them together. So yeah, I guess even if I can say from my brief experience, planning from start to finish is to be conscious of the analysis when designing the questionnaire, be conscious of the questionnaire when designing the analysis to make your life easier. Because it sucked, but we still got it done. It was great, but it just would have been a lot easier if I had taken this last step. But yeah, thanks for letting me share my tale.
Sure. And those are the 6. I mean, there's a lot more learning that we're still doing, and that there's a lot more learning that we can share, but that's a session for another day. I think the last thing to remember, and this has been reiterated from the beginning, is that there's no sense in collecting all this amazing data and never using it. Only collect data if you're actually going to use it. And in that, I'll open up the floor to some questions. There were 2 that I noted. And one is from Susie, which is basically the question around, is a log frame a detailed theory of change? I'll let Leanne answer that. And the second question would be from Max. How does one go about challenging embedded structures in nonprofit? I'll let anyone answer that on the panel.
So I'll do the log frame theory of change. I think so I think Talia addressed it pretty well in the chat. So the log frame a lot of the time tells us the indicators or the indicators that we use to measure certain outputs, outcomes, activities. But it doesn't always explain why that's happening or what the theory is underlying the structure. So I'd say it's not the same thing, because the theory is more why do we hold these beliefs about change, and the log frame is kind of more, I would say, more like analytical, like structured, quantitative in a way document about, if we want to measure this, this is what we need to do. So I would say that there's a difference. With the why being the big thing about the differentiating factor. I don't know about the other question. Does anyone else want to hazard
Cindy, would you be able to speak to challenging embedded structures in nonprofits?
Sure. I think the first step is to kind of establish or try to change the culture around learning. I think that when Mel, a lot of the times in organization, Mel is scary because it's trying to point out what you're doing wrong. So I think as soon as like just getting everyone on the same page from like, and this is everyone from the CEO to everyone that's implementing on the ground, to just understand that like no data is bad data. And I think once everyone starts feeling that, then it feels like a safer space to start to look at what could be happening, whether it's showing that the program is working really well in one area, but there needs to be more improvement in others. So I think once you start to unpack that and change that mindset about it, which takes a lot of time, and just you have to be a bit patient. Not everyone likes to talk about these things. So just having a lot of patience and changing that mindset really helps to start having those conversations. And it's good to just kind of facilitate a discussion. I also think it's really good to start with games and to make it a bit lighthearted. I think sometimes Mel can seem very systematic and straightforward. And I think if you add the human element to it, it really helps people like build that trust to start breaking down those barriers.
There's a question from Talia about ethics and privacy. How do we as Mal practitioners manage that? Or how do we, maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Sweet. I'd love to jump in if that's all right, Mbali. Also, hey, Talia. With ethics and privacy, I'll touch on privacy first because it's the more boring one, but also vitally important. So when conducting questionnaires and surveys and data collection, it is important to remember the individual's rights. They need informed consent. They need to know why they're answering the questionnaire. They need to be reassured that their answers will remain anonymous unless otherwise instructed. So yeah, I guess even the same as kind of any other data collection system in this modern age. Just ensuring that they know that their questions are private and that their data will be confidential. In terms of ethics, I quite like this because it can change. It's more trying to find like a very neutral way to ask questions. So for example, one of the questions when I first wrote a questionnaire was, what was on there was, do you feel safe at Skateistan? Which upon a second look, you kind of realize it's a bit leading, where like within that question, it's already like, you kind of assume you're feeling safe. So a much more kind of ethical question would be, how do you feel at Skateistan? Just in terms of the actual writing. But I mean, ethics can also stretch to the environment, like where is the individual answering the questions? Is it within Skateistan, is it in the teacher's office where they'll feel a bit more bureaucratic or, a bit more formal, where they only go to, have a serious discussion. Also the environment, can other students overhear them? Will they, make jokes about it later? Or will they answer similar to their friend or the one they think is the coolest kind of thing? So yeah, it's just kind of really assessing it and trying to make it as like down the line, like uninfluential as possible. Almost like in ours, we try to almost err to the side of negative because you really want to find the failures, but yeah, trying to just stay bang on the middle, super platonic. Cool.
Yeah, I think two things to add to that is also how safe are your documents online if you're asking for students to scan, or if you have registration information, if you're using systems like Salesforce, who has access to those systems and who can access phone numbers, as well as what the language. So when you're asking kids questions and they don't understand it because maybe the questions are in English, are you able to translate those questions? And can you translate the question to mean the same thing? For example, the word confidence doesn't exist in Zulu. So if I had to explain to a child that I'm asking them about confidence, I'd have to figure it out first to make sure that the intention is the same, but that I'm asking a question about confidence without confusing the child, because I can't say e-confidence. There's no such thing. But we need to find those words. And these are conversations we have to have as a team to be like, okay, how do we filter down these questions to be as simple and understandable as possible to children without using language that confuses them or leads them. Let me see, did I miss out on any questions, guys? I think if I'm missing any questions out, please also just unmute your mic and share your question. But the next question I got, which I thought was really interesting, is how do you know if something is too vague? How do you know if your goal is too vague? Maybe you want to improve social cohesion. Is that too vague a goal? And is that something you should even be trying to do? Leanne, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So the short answer, yes. I'd say that anytime that you can't like physically draw the line between exactly how your program, how the activity or the outcome of your program leads to that thing, it's a step too far. And I also think you put yourself into a difficult situation if you create a goal that's too big and you promise that to a funder and then you can't deliver on that. That's, yeah, like and then the funder wants to see the evidence of like, okay, so show me the built community or show me the more cohesive community or whatever it is. And you can't do that because, I mean, I think, you know, and they're like, I'll take the poverty thing, you know, they're like, these are like national country level outcomes or goals, and they're often contributed to, or people contribute to them by sort of like the collective work that they're doing. And so I think it's not to say that you aren't contributing, but it's almost a step too far or a little bit more of a push to say, yeah, my program has empowered all women, or my program has ended gender-based violence against, you know, for women. So I think it's just, and then I think for me, the immediate thing is like, well, how are you going to measure it? And if you can't think of a way to measure it, or there's no easy way of like asking someone or, yeah, speaking to people about it, I think that would be the way you know that it's too vague. I personally, my opinion or my caution is always to err on the side of caution and always to keep it close, as close to the program as possible. Just because I've seen examples of people promising things like reducing violence in a community. And it's like, there's so many causes of violence in a community. There's no way that your one program or the one thing that you're doing is ultimately going to do that. And also, why would you want to be responsible for that? Because if it doesn't work, is it on you? Because you said that you would do that. So yes. Yeah, my guidance would be just keep the circle smaller rather than larger.
Okay, I'm just looking at the chat again to see if there are any other questions. Okay, I see here that there were a couple of questions from Clara. Clara, do you want to unmute and ask the questions in person?
Yes, of course. Sorry, I'm happy to say them out loud. But yeah, so again, my name is Clara, and I'm working more from a donors or funders perspective. So these are all very interesting topics for us. And I was wondering if there is a way to measure more indirect benefits on society or communities. So basically what I'm most familiar with is seeing, you know, direct impacts on beneficiaries, the participants you work with, or the local employment that are created. But is it possible to, in a way, measure indirect benefits and the broader benefits that it has on communities and societies? So that was the first question that I have. I don't know if anyone could answer that, or if anyone as an organization is working on such impact measurement. And then I think also another valuable insights that would be very valuable is to know the long-term impact it has on individuals, maybe through longer term contacts, or just tracking that when you have a participant joining your programs for a while, that maybe in 5 years' time, where are they at? How has the organization had an impact on its life, or just generally on its skills, or anything that can track also the longer term impact. And then the 2 other questions, sorry, I'm just dropping out my 4 questions here, but were mostly about, you see that there is this entire and thriving social skate community out there, and it would be also very insightful to understand how, as a community, you have an impact. All the organizations together have an impact. Of course, all organizations are working differently on different activities with different missions and objectives, but there is still a centralized impact that would be very interesting to measure, to be able to also continue growing this community and finding more support for it. So I think that would be very interesting. I don't know how that's even possible, but I know the Goodpush can already find a lot of data through the surveys, but it would be interesting to centralize certain metrics as a social skate community. And then lastly, and this is a bit more theoretical as well, I was just wondering if some organizations look into social return on investment research, just understanding how once you inject a certain amount of money in an organization, how this has positive externalities on society, and that can be also very interesting for just academic research, and also more generally for finding funding and support for this community. So these were my thoughts. Sorry, it's a lot, but if anyone wants to jump on that, I'm happy to hear some thoughts back.
I can talk a little bit about the long-term impact. I'm just aware also of time, as we do have another session starting very soon. So I'll just try and answer as quickly as possible the question about long-term impact. I think one of the things that Skateistan does well is to keep in touch with our students through developing an alumni program. That was a way for us to keep in contact with our students, understand where they are. It's not another program, so they're not still our beneficiaries, but it is a way for us to track that change. We've spoken to quite a few of them to ask them as a story of growth. We've interviewed them about what it is that Skateistan did for them during their time here. And something that we're interested in doing in the future is also developing some kind of like a longitudinal study and speak to children who are in the programs now, and then again in a couple of years, and keep tracking that change. But that's another story for another day. It's a much bigger project. We don't have time for that now. But I think one of the things that we can talk about before we close off, maybe Leanne, you can close off with this one, is the measuring of indirect benefits, right, Clara?
Yes, that was my question.
Yeah, I think we can close off with that.
I'm going to take a quick stab at the joint impact of the skate community, and suggest looking at collective impact as a concept. There's some work going on in collective impact in South Africa in the sport for development sector, kind of. But yeah, there's a wealth of literature looking at collective impact, how to come up with it, its methodology, how to get buy-in, get stakeholders to buy in. And so essentially it's looking at how many people working on the same sector collectively have impact on society or on communities. I suppose that speaks to your other question around measuring more indirect benefits on societies. Honestly, I would like this, my most simplest answer would be like, just ask them, like, how has it affected them? I think we just negate that like next level of asking people, how has this changed your community? And I think Mbali spoke to it about parents or grandparents, teachers, the people who are kind of on that next level of outside of the participants that our beneficiaries that we don't often engage with. I've heard the most wonderful stories and just the most insightful feedback from that level of people. So I think it's good enough evidence to just interview them or survey them or chat with them, have a focus group. So that would be my suggestion about how to assess that.
Yeah, I think just due to time, we'll have to close this session. But I just wanted to thank all of our speakers. Thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Niall. Thank you, Cindy. And yes, I think we have spoken about meeting together in the future to continue having MEL discussions. So once we have a better plan for that, we'll definitely start to share that through Goodpush. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.